Welcome to HortTube. My name is Jim Putnam. This is the February garden checklist video. We do one of these each month, and I've been doing these for a couple of years. Kind of streamlined them in the last year or so down to just exactly what we're doing in our garden here in Raleigh, North Carolina, Zone 7B. This is about 0.19 acres, a very small lot. If you haven't followed along, there's a playlist called New House where I go through the entire progress of starting from the beginning of this garden until now. Let's jump right into what we'll be doing here in February. I plant pretty much 12 months out of the year. So, you know, here in Raleigh, the ground really never freezes. You know, we might get a little frozen crust on top of the ground for a few days during the winter, but other than that, the ground's pretty workable year round here. So I don't think about it as much as, you know, people put a lot of stock in what is the best month to plant. Again, if the ground's workable and I'm going to be around to care for it and watch out for it, I'll plant whenever. I am careful this time of year to make sure that I'm not planting plants that are way ahead of my area, meaning that the garden center, box store, or wherever you're getting plants, even mail order, if it comes in the mail and it's further ahead of everything else that's in your landscape, sometimes I'll wait and plant those things just because, you know, if this abelia has been sitting outside here in the garden all winter long, I would have no problem whatsoever putting this plant in the ground. It's completely acclimated to our weather conditions through this winter, and it's right in line with everything that's in the landscape. But if this came from the Gulf Coast into my garden center and I bought it and it was just completely covered in new growth, maybe even had a flower or two on it, that's the kind of plant that's going to be vulnerable to a late, you know, to any kind of freeze or frost. So keep that in mind. As long as the plant seems acclimated, if it's asleep when it's supposed to be asleep, put it in the ground as long as the ground is workable. So we're going to really be concentrating this spring on ground covers. We put a lot of shrubs in. This has mostly been a shrub channel the entire time I've had this channel, because that's what I grew in my nursery, and most of the original videos were about shrubs, and you know, shrubs are kind of my thing. We've got about as many shrubs and narrow trees as we can put into this landscape, and at this point I really want to save on maintenance and the price of mulch. And so we're going to be concentrating a lot on ground covers. And so that'll be part of the content during the spring season, is trying to get kind of the rest of the ground covered. So we're not having, you know, again, when we mulch, it'll be, you know, very little. One thing that might be available in your area are some pansies, violas, snapdragons, dianthus, some of the very early blooming or winter flowering annuals. We've got here's some violas that we planted earlier in the fall. They've been in the ground for a little while. The roots are pretty well established on these, so they'll take off pretty quick as it warms up this spring, but they're certainly available probably at a garden center near you, and they'll last until about, here in the south, until about June, you know, 1st of June, mid-June, something like that, and then they'll burn out if that's worth it to you, to plug a few things into a container here in February and March and enjoy some color a couple months earlier than some other things will be up in the landscape. They're probably available. So by the time you see this video, we will have already seeded on our light rack inside our cool season vegetables that we do, that we start early inside. So that's going to be things like broccoli, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts. Some of our lettuce will start inside just to extend that season. Those things won't go in the ground until about March, but we do seed them in early February. We've still got a couple types of kale that have survived the winter, and we can still harvest from these as we go. There's some garden prep though that needs to be done out here. And so while we're waiting for those vegetables that we started from seed in the house to be ready, we'll get in here into the vegetable garden. We'll get out any weeds that we have. We'll put down a fresh layer of compost and just generally be ready to plant those things. When those things come out and get acclimated to the outdoors, the things that we've pre-seeded, the garden will be ready for us to do our direct seeding things. And that will be things like peas, kohlrabi, beets, carrots, you know, root vegetables and peas and beans. Those things we direct seed into the ground. We also have our kale and a couple of other things as well that we do just direct seeded out here. But again, we use the month of February to weed, prep it, get ready for it, because we're going to have our cool season crops going at the beginning of March. Then we'll be starting our summer crops inside in the 1st of March, and those will go in right behind these about middle of April. And so the garden will be full. So we're going to use February as prep time. So you may have noticed when I was over in the vegetable garden that there's a plastic fence around it. It's actually a 7-foot tall deer fence, but it's folded over, so it's only 3.5 feet tall. And it surrounds that space to keep rabbits out of it. The rabbits don't mess with the summer garden very much. You know, they tend not to like peppers, but they do in fact love every leafy green. And so, you know, you got to think through that. If you're putting leafy greens in, they either need to be in raised beds, or you need to have some sort of barrier to prevent the rabbits from getting to them. When you visit garden centers, box stores, wherever, right now you'll probably see strawberries, asparagus, seed potatoes, lots and lots of different edible things that you can add to your garden. Probably one of the best times of year to buy fruit trees and, you know, just all kinds of edible plants in general. You may purchase them and then look up for your area when you would be putting those things in the ground. I don't want to sit here on a, you know, Zone 7B in Raleigh and tell you the day that you should be putting those things in the ground, but I will tell you, you probably should acquire them if you want them, or, you know, fairly early on, and then again look up, you know, the best time for in your area to put those things in the ground. So let's jump to all things fertilizer. Sometime during the month of February, I'll be fertilizing the entire garden out here. And so that includes the vegetable garden because we're prepping it for all of our cool season vegetables to go in. I just use an organic fertilizer. I'll talk about that in the video, but I don't care what it is. If it's ground cover, shrub, tree, edible thing, container thing, whatever it is, I throw out the same fertilizer on it. Again, very low amount of fertilizer. Most of the feeding that's going on in this garden is from mulch. We'll talk about mulch coming up in just a minute, because that's another thing we're doing in February. The only things that I'll repeat fertilize will be things like the vegetable garden. And so we'll fertilize it here as we prep it. Our cool season vegetables will go in sometime. You know, when we put the summer vegetables in, I'll probably throw out another application. Our annual borders, where we have, like I showed you, the pansies, violas, panolas, any of our summer flowers that go in during the summer, we will repeat fertilize. But for the most part, there's very little fertilizer going into this landscape, and it will almost 90% of the fertilizing will be done in the month of February in a video. So some of these monthly videos we do, like in the summer or in the late fall, early winter, are just a lot of prep and getting ready and thinking about the future and writing things down and those kinds of things. February is ready to roll. I mean, February into mid-March are probably the busiest time of the year in the garden for me. We leave the leaves on the ground out here from the trees, and I want to mulch over the top of them. And so we need to get the leaves off the path, the leaves off any turf areas, the leaves off any place we don't want leaves before we put that mulch cap on. A lot of other things we want to do too before we mulch. We want to go through and do any edging we're going to do. February is a great time, you know, to re-edge beds, because typically you've had some rain in the wintertime, the soil's a little softer. Might be a little later if you're in the north and the ground's a little more frozen, but as it thaws out, it's certainly a great time of year to be edging beds. The other thing we got to do is all of our pruning. I don't want to put this mulch cap down over these leaves and then walk through it constantly. And so again, it's this leaf removal, edging, any disturbances I'm going to be doing. If I'm planting some shrubs or some trees and I can get those done before I mulch, that's great too. You know, just any kind of disturbance is going to bring weed seeds to the top. And so as much of the pruning as we can, we're going to get done. So our ground covers need pruning. Our shrubs, a lot of our shrubs need pruning. We had some winter damage back in December. Probably a lot of you watching this had some winter damage back in December. So we're going to try to cut some of that material back that needs to be pruned. Some of our material back here that's in a little more shade than it would like, and it's a little stretched, those things are going to get cut back. So there's going to be a lot of pruning out here. Several things I'll say on pruning. Number one, you need to really know what you have. And so if it's a flowering thing, and you don't know whether it blooms on last year's wood, meaning it grew all last year and then set flower buds before the winter. If you prune that in the wintertime, you're pruning the flowers off. Azaleas would be a great example of that. If you don't know what you have, just wait until it flowers and then prune it after it flowers, and then you don't have to worry about this. But there are things that, you know, we don't rely on flowers for. They flower, you know, things like low-growing hollies or boxwoods, a lot of flowering plants that we're growing them because they're just green, right? Those things can be pruned. Ground covers, non-flowering things. If it's a flowering thing and it blooms in the summertime, typically you can prune those in the winter. If it's an early flowering spring thing, typically you want to avoid pruning them until after they flower. That's kind of a brief summary on pruning. Again, is if it's an early flowering thing, you don't want to be pruning it now. There will be some damaged things though in people's landscapes that just aren't going to bloom well regardless, and you're probably going to be able to look at that thing and go, even if it flowers, it's going to be attractive, and you might want to go ahead and cut it back this winter. And a lot of the bigger pruning jobs, I'll wait a little further into February. You know, it won't be the very first thing I'll do in February, but I want to get them done sooner than later. Here in Zone 7B in Raleigh, and especially even further south, are grasses and grass-like plants. So our ornamental grasses, you know, the grasses that get little plumes, and decorative grasses, and our carexes and, you know, sedges, rushes, you know, all of those kinds of things. You need to get those cut back in February before the new growth starts on them. So then that would include things like liriope. If you were going to prune back any mondo grass or scalp it off, those are projects you're going to want to do in February. We're going to start cutting back our perennials, and so we leave most of our perennials up through the winter. Not the most attractive thing in the world, but it gives good cover for the plant that's under the ground, and you know, any insects and things like that that were living on them through the winter time. But it is time to clean those up. Again, I want to do as much prep as I can possibly do before we put mulch down in order to not create disturbances in the bed that will create very weedy conditions during the summer. A few more pruning things. I put up a video a couple weeks ago pruning back the old leaves on hellebores, and you can see this one coming out, just showing off the new foliage and the new flowers without the distraction of the old leaves that were on them. So that's one thing that we do. This cast iron plant, typically we wait for some new growth to come out on them and then cut them back some, but the cold really got this one. And so this is an example of a plant, and I'm probably just going to go ahead and cut it completely back. Again, normally I would be doing selective pruning. It would just be the oldest growth on it, but there's really nothing here to save. And so we're going to see some new growth on it here in the next few weeks, and it's just going to get chopped back. This will be the time to do regenerative pruning. And so if you've got a shrub that's just gotten completely out of control, and you got to get control of it, and you want to cut it down to, you know, 18 inches tall, and it's 6 feet tall today, this is the time of year to do it. So February, March, best time to do that. This Mahonia that's next to me here, if it needed, you know, if I felt like it just needed to go down to the ground, I'd absolutely do it right now while it's dormant. Would be the best time of year to do that. There's some black mondo grass. I know this is all covered in leaves. We're gonna get all these perennials uncovered here before we mulch, but here's some black mondo grass right here, and we want to use this in a few places. It's finally starting to spread about a bit. If I wanted to dig this up and divide it, this would be the time to do it. So any of the perennials here that I can see, or even ones I can't, you know, if it's a hosta and I kind of know where it is, I can pop it out of the ground and divide it right now. And just a great time of year to do that. Again, the ground's very workable. You can pop things out of the ground, cut them with a shovel, put them in 2 new homes, give one away, whatever you want to do. Great time of year to do that. One other flowering shrub that I can definitely prune on are my Camellia sasanquas, as they finish blooming at this point. These are the fall blooming camellias. They'll typically bloom until right about the time you're watching this video. And so if they need any work, I'll cut on those. My Camellia japonicas, the later blooming camellias, are probably still blooming, and they'll just get cut after flowering. If you cut things after they flower, not a problem. Of course, dormant trees like this red bud, if it needed any work right now, this would be the time to do it. I think I need to get in here while it's dormant, while there's no leaves on it. I got a perennial falling on it. I'll cut back as well here in the month of February. But any of these limbs up here that I'm looking at, and I can see they're clearly crossing one another, and they're just going to be inside the plant this season rubbing on one another, I'm going to go ahead and get rid of those. You know, get rid of one of the 2 of them. I'll make a decision on which one I want. But here's an example. It's just 2 limbs that are going to rub one another all year. This one being the dominant one that's almost all the way down to the ground. This little side one, I'm not going to be able to see it anyway. It's just going to be damaging this one, so I'll probably cut it off. So I'm looking at trees that way. You know, if there's limbs that are going to be rubbing one another during the season, and I can see it right now, right? So I'll get in here and get those out while it's easy. So part of our strategy leading up to putting in our cool season vegetable seeds is a lot of planning. And so we, you know, think through, you know, what has worked well for us in the past, you know, what we're going to do, you know, whether we're keeping something, getting rid of it. All those things are done, you know, through writing things down. And so making sure that you're labeling things, whether it's going in the ground, you know, some sort of label in the ground, in a container, whatever you're doing in, you know, your seeding trays, those kinds of things, so that you can keep up with what works and what doesn't work on a year-to-year basis. It's super, super helpful. This plant next to me is an Edgeworthia, and it blooms during the month of February typically, and it's already starting to open underneath. It's got nodding flowers, so they tend to be, you know, pointing down at the ground, but you can pull them up. They're wonderfully fragrant. Just fantastic, just a fantastic plant. It's one of the strategies we have in this landscape, is to have something blooming all the time, and we can do that here in the South. You know, the hellebores are starting near me. We'll have daffodils in a week or two. Again, this Edgeworthia, there's a few camellias that are starting to open, and by March it'll be a whole nother series of things. So it's one of those things that we're out in the world planning for. If you haven't bought seeds, whatever kind of seeds, whether you're going to do summer vegetable seeds or you're going to do flower seeds, perennial seeds, doesn't matter what it is, I'd go ahead and buy them sooner than later. There's been kind of a shortage with all the new gardeners in the last few years buying seed. And I go ahead and buy my fall seed at the exact same time. So, you know, if you're going to do fall vegetables, like we've just done cool season vegetables now, we go ahead and acquire those now, because I don't trust that the things that I want will be available later. Another thing that will be available for purchase this time of year are going to be summer bulbs. So things like liatris, elephant ears, caladiums, what else am I missing from that list? Dahlias, and lots more. There's a lot of things that will be available. It's, again, not necessarily the time to put them in the ground in your area. I can get dahlia tubers now, but they are cold sensitive, and so I will just store them until it's time to put them in the ground, which will be after my average last frost date, which is sometime around mid-April. So keep that in mind, but do go ahead and acquire them. Just keep them to the side. Don't put those tropical things in the ground right now. Make sure all your tools are ready for the season. It's one of those things that's kind of easy to get past you. You know, you pull out the lawnmower and realize that you didn't sharpen the blade and you didn't change the oil, and you need whatever you need to do on tools, and sharpen blades on pruners. This month of February, we're gonna be pruning like crazy, and so, you know, I want to make sure I have the proper tools and they're sharp enough so I'm not leaving jagged edges on things. To us, birds are a very important part of the garden. They can help you with some of your insect problems, and they're just a fun part of outdoor activities. Hearing them in the morning, hearing them, I can, you know, listen to them right now. And so, you know, we're cleaning the bird bath, cleaning out bird houses, feeding them, and we're just inviting them, making a good space available for them. We're planting native plants that are good for them as well, that they enjoy, and it's another thing we're out shopping for, is additional native plants for, you know, for our pollinators. And, you know, there's not, you know, as I'm sitting here in the middle of these camellias, which are non-invasive, non-natives, we do have a lot of native plants in this garden, and we want to continue to add to that in the future. Great time of year to be going and visiting gardens. You can go in February and see all the amazing things that you could potentially have in your garden and as part of your garden, or not have in your garden, and just go and enjoy this time of year, because those gardens are starting to really wake up and ramp up. And I guarantee you, almost every garden, every great botanic garden arboretum in the country has early flowering displays, whether it be bulbs, pansies, you know, annual things, who knows what it is, or shrubs that are already waking up and blooming. It's definitely worth going and visiting and seeing the things that you can have for kind of a year-round garden. So then, after all those tasks, the cleaning and edging and making new bed space, there's a couple spaces back here I want to make some new bed space, and all the pruning, and vast majority, and pruning back perennials and shrubs and all those kinds of things. Once the vast majority of those things are done, then we will mulch during the month of February. So sometime mid to late February, you'll see a mulching video. I'm just going to use triple shredded hardwood, which is what they call it here. It's just hardwood mulch that's been ground 2 or 3 times, and it lasts longer than some other things for me. But you can use whatever you want to as mulch. You can use the leaves like I've got out here if you want to get some new leaves before they're all gone, and grind them up and use that. You can use pine bark. Pine bark tends to float. Pine bark and pine bark mini nuggets and nuggets, if you're in an area that gets a lot of rainfall or you got any kind of slope, they tend to float somewhat. You can use wood chips, but if you're using wood chips in existing beds, I would go a little thinner You know, I wouldn't put down, you know, big giant layer of wood chips like I would if I was starting new beds. So there's lots and lots of things. Pine straw, that'd be another example of something you can mulch with. You mulch with whatever. I'll be using something called triple shredded hardwood. I don't know what it's called in your area, but it's just hardwood bark that's been ground up. Fairly fine consistency. What I like about it is it's different size materials and it tends to lock on itself, get a little bit of a crust on top of it, which again is good for preventing weeds from germinating, because that's the main thing I want to avoid is all summer long being out here combating weeds. Watering in the month of February here in Raleigh, very, very little of it. When we put something new in the ground, we'll water it in just to settle it in. But for the most part, we won't need water on anything. You know, we'll check our containers of some, you know, things that have been in the containers for a little while longer, because if it does warm up and they start to put on some new growth, maybe they'll use some water. But for the most part, not a lot of watering to be done. February is a very busy month, and I kind of like it, because here in this area it's 65, you know, let's say 55 degrees to 70 degrees almost every day. And so you can come out and work hard in it without, you know, without it being too cold and without it being too hot. The ground is very workable, kind of easy, you know, just kind of easier overall. And it kind of gets you, you know, where you're doing these things and you're setting yourself up for later in the year so that, you know, you can really, you know, get these projects behind you so that you can enjoy the time in the garden while it's actively growing later in the season and not feel like you know, have to be throwing yourself and working in it when it's 95 degrees outside. So there you go. That's the February garden checklist. Thank you guys very much for following along with the channel, and we'll be back in March with another one. Thanks for watching.